It's great to welcome Professor Darryl Hart of Hillsdale College to the program once again. I believe this is the third time he's been on this show. Today we're discussing his brief history of Calvinism, which was written in a book titled Calvinism, A History. Darryl, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. It's nice to see you again and be with you. I'm doing okay, a little bit of a rush this morning, but I think I'm relatively well prepared to talk about this. The book's a little dated from my perspective, so I hope I can answer your questions.
Okay, let's begin. Before we start, I'd like to mention the passing of the world famous pastor John MacArthur, who many regard as a Calvinist. So, to what extent does he reflect John Calvin's teachings?
Well, that's one of the issues I was trying to address in the book, and how wide to describe Calvinism, or if it's more narrowly when you talk about institutions and Reformed churches as opposed to Lutheran or Anglican. And Presbyterian is very much similar, adjacent to, in the same lane as Reformed, but the Reformed churches are on the continent. The Presbyterian churches are in Great Britain and then the British colonies. And and so Presbyterian is more of an English speaking. But I tend in my historical inquiry to be absorbed with institutions more than persons, because I think institutions have more staying power. They're more representative in a way, not always representative, but they're still more representative than, say, a celebrity or an influential pastor like MacArthur, who has a large following, but it's not clear what it means to be a member of that following necessarily, while it's maybe more easy to identify what it is to be a member of a Reformed church, to be a graduate of a Reformed school or seminary, etc. So, long-winded answer to your question. I mean, there are people who are Calvinists and believe in especially Calvin's teaching on salvation, who would claim to be Calvinists. But within, I think within scholarly circles, maybe it's not as much the case, but also among people who are scholars in Reformed churches, we tend to be a little bit more particular about that and say, no, there's more to Calvinism than just his doctrine of salvation. There are the sacraments, there's worship, there may even be eschatology and the like. So, um, yeah, I mean, but MacArthur is a good representative of the kind of Calvinism that has wide, to the extent that it's popular. And it's not always very popular. Um, I mean, there are a lot of hurdles it has to clear, but it does have a following, and MacArthur certainly picked up on that.
Certainly. Okay. So that neatly leads me to the next question, which is, what do you find to be the most common misconceptions about Calvinist Christianity?
Well, I mean, there are two. One of them, I think, is in some ways more intriguing and better misconception worth following than the other. The one that is more worth considering is the so-called Calvinist work ethic and Max Weber's discussion of Calvinism. And I mean, I don't think Calvinists, that wing of Protestantism alone, is responsible for having a better understanding of ordinary non-religious work that's legal, not illegal work. So bakers, bankers, plumbers, all sort of could find some notion of the value of their work because of Calvin, but especially Luther, even before Calvin, talking about vocations as ways of serving neighbors and honoring God. The more difficult, and I think cliched one, and it's one of the black eyes under which Calvinism suffers, which is predestination. Um, and predestination has a long pedigree in Christian theology well before Calvin. Aquinas, Augustine, to give just a couple of examples, have certain views of predestination, and Calvin may add a few wrinkles to it, but he's still not an outlier in that larger conversation. But when I think one of the reasons why Calvinism has a black eye is because of this idea of the elect, everything's predestined, everything's already predetermined, and human beings have no free will whatsoever. And and this is where, I mean, I actually think, now I'm going to correct myself, this is something worth pursuing more. Oh man, the journalist Oliver, and I can't remember his last name now, but I want to say Burke, but I don't think that's right. I heard he wrote a book about determinism 5 or 6 years ago. I heard him on a podcast with Robert Wright, which is now the Non-Zero podcast. But back then it was on bloggingheadstv.com. And he wrote a book about why determinism makes more sense. And in many ways it's counterintuitive. But even William James wrote a famous piece about determinism in this way, that if you don't have some kind of determinism in the world, the alternative is seemingly chaos. I'm not a philosopher. I can't explain this necessarily. And I'm not sure why you can't have some kind of position in the middle between chaos and determinism. But I mean, when I've read James, and I've taught James sometimes in American intellectual history, students struggle with it. But there's a degree to which it makes sense. And in that sense, again, Calvin is not an outlier.
That's it. So I believe it's Oliver Berkman. That
Berkman, thank
yeah,
you.
yeah,
It's a
I thought
fascinating interview if anybody can find it.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, I should check that out too, the interview. Okay. So I believe yeah, you've mentioned the sort of differences between Anglo-American Calvinism or Reform church institutions. You have the Presbyterian Church, PCA, PCUSA, and in continental Europe, you call it Reform. So
Right.
I I happen to know live close to at least like three Reformed churches here in Budapest, Hungary. There's a vibrant Reform presence here. So if a Reform, like your average Reform churchgoer and your average Presbyterian churchgoer, if they happen to meet, would they align on theological matters?
Generally speaking, yes. Um, I mean, the way it plays out in America is that you have different ethnic groups who are either Reformed. If you're of Scottish, English, or Irish descent in America, typically you are from Presbyterian backgrounds because of the way that church reforms played out in England and Scotland and Ireland in the 16th century and beyond. And what's striking about that is uh, the English and Scottish reformers, many of whom were actually exiles in Calvin's Geneva in the 1550s, sometimes later 1570s, depending on the politics in England. And they sort of went all in on Calvin's understanding of church polity, where you have the church governed by councils, which are made up of pastors and elders are lay people who have secular vocations typically, but then are also overseers in the church. And then there are deacons, and there are teachers. In Calvin's Geneva, the teachers was a special office for the Geneva Academy, which trained kids all the way up to training clergy. Um, so the Scots and the English were particularly attached to Calvin's church government because of their experience as exiles and because of the conditions pushing for reform against a a, a monarch who had royal supremacy over the church, as well as encrusted bishops. But in America, again, back to the ethnic point, the German Reformed, the Dutch Reformed, Hungarian Reformed churches here as well. So those churches from the continent usually break down ethnically in America, nationally, oftentimes, or politically in some ways in Europe, but they are attached to the Reformed identity. And I personally, not that you need to know this or the listeners do, but I have been in the Christian Reformed Church, which is the Dutch Reformed Church founded in mid 19th century by Dutch immigrants. And I've also now been in Presbyterian churches, and the two groups do cooperate in a variety of ways and have fraternal relations. And one particular denomination, the United Reformed Churches, which is a spin-off from the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church. They have combined with my own denomination, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, to put out a Psalter hymnal. So, and in the back of that Psalter hymnal are the doctrinal standards of both of our communions. And for the Presbyterians, it's the Westminster Confession of Faith and larger and shorter catechisms. And for the Dutch Reformed, it's the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and then the canons of the Synod of Dort. But all of those are in the back of this hymnal, even though only one church confesses group of those standards and the other the other. But we all sing out of the same playbook, as it were. So there is I mean, the biggest difference, actually, there have been efforts to unite the two streams in America of Dutch and American Presbyterian. And the one big hangup concerns church polity in the sense that, and this is really getting into the weeds, and I apologize, but this is also part of the nature of why Calvinism is not merely soteriology, but it's also church government. Um, in the in the Dutch Reformed churches, the pastor is actually a member of the congregation and has a vote within the deliberations of the congregation. And in Presbyterianism, the pastor is not a member of the congregation, but he's a member of the presbytery, which is a regional body which kind of oversees the churches within that region. The Dutch Reformed also have oversight through a classis, their equivalent of a presbytery, which oversees the churches in that region. But somehow, the way the Dutch polity played out, the pastors have their membership in the local church and not in the presbytery. Or you could say it's a quirk of the American system that the pastors have their membership in the presbytery. And that's been the reasons behind that. The different kinds of church government have made it stickier for try to figure out, okay, so how do we combine in one church? Which kind of polity are we going to use, or are we going to do an amalgam? I don't know.
I see. Okay. Well, I'll leave that for your respective churches to decide, I suppose. Yeah, I'm a Catholic, so we know what our church hierarchy is.
Right.
Okay. So tell me about Geneva, Switzerland. How did Calvinism manage to take root there?
Well, um, there were efforts of reform in Switzerland, which Switzerland itself is a very decentralized place, and the history of Switzerland is fascinating, and I don't know enough of it. But the real origins of Reformed churches, as opposed to Lutheran, are in Zurich with Zwingli and the Zurich Reformation in 1522, I want to say, maybe 21 even. And I've been back in 2009, I was at two conferences in Geneva, which was the 500th anniversary of Calvin's birth. And I picked up on a little bit of resentment that the Zurich people had about Geneva, that there's a sense of, no, we came first, we should matter more than Geneva does, but because Calvin became a star, but also what made Geneva different from Zurich is that um, Zurich is German speaking, uh, Geneva French speaking, but Geneva was a late uh, member within the Swiss Confederation, and it was also a site where a lot of refugees went, especially a lot of French refugees because it was French Protestants, Huguenot, as they're called. So it had much, and then I've already mentioned that the English and Scottish refugees during different political administrations back in the British Isles. So Geneva had much more of a home for refugees, and I think that gives Geneva much more of an international flavor in Calvin's time. It wasn't as if Calvin was an open borders kind of guy and send us all your, the Statue of Liberty sort of thing. But it just wound up being a place where a lot of refugees went. The locals were not happy with it by any means. I mean, there was a lot of fights within Geneva about this, and how Geneva handled it is another question. But Geneva to this day, with parts of the United Nations there, and it has a kind of Red Cross headquarters, et cetera, et cetera. It has this kind of humanitarian international presence, and you can trace it back to the 1530s and 40s when refugees started to go there. But I mean, it's kind of a lark that it becomes as important as it does. Calvin goes there in 1536. He didn't want to go to Geneva. He was on the run from authorities in France, where he was not welcome as a Protestant, or at least part of France where he was. He goes to Strasbourg, other places, but William Farel, who's from another city near Geneva, twists Calvin's arm to go to Geneva. Calvin starts the reform process in 1536. He he wears out his welcome in 1538. He advocates, and again, this goes into church polity, but he advocates that the church should have the powers of spiritual discipline. And the city government wanted the powers of spiritual discipline as well as civil discipline. And Calvin insisted on the former, that the church had that power, and the city officials asked him to leave, and he did, and he went to Strasbourg and worked with Martin Butzer there. But then in 1541, the city officials still wanted a reformed church, and they couldn't make it work without Calvin, so they brought Calvin back, and then he stayed in Geneva from 1541 to 1564 when he died. I believe he did not get citizenship, though. It's very hard to get citizenship still in Switzerland, depending on the canton, but I think it's still the case. Overall, Calvin, I don't think, gained citizenship until the last 10 years of his life. He was always sort of in this exile sort of situation, even though he had this major position within the Geneva churches.
Now, if we were to ask John Calvin, you know, why did the church needed reforming, would we get the answer of, well, what Luther said, or would he add more into that answer?
Um, I haven't thought about that question for a while. That's why I'm pausing. And I always hate when people say they don't know the answer. Oh, that's a good question. But it is it's still a good question. Um, and I, I mean, Calvin is sort of he is a second generation reformer. Luther, if I recall correctly, was born in 1483, Calvin 1509. That is what? That's a 27-year difference, 26-year difference. I don't know. My math is not good on the fly necessarily. So that would be a different generation. And my understanding of Luther is that it was in some ways accidental, the way it played out. He didn't like, especially the question of indulgences, which led him to raise all sorts of questions about the practice of selling indulgences and the theology behind that. And then from the way that that played out with the papacy at the time, the bishops at the time, even his own prince, who was a Roman Catholic, but who was a supporter of Luther because Luther worked at the Prince's Seminary University. Um, it just took on a different dynamic than what Calvin faced, where he was a convert at roughly 1533, 2, somewhere in there. It's always kind of murky how people identify that. And then he begins to pastor 2 or 3 years later, which is kind of remarkable. He writes the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion as a young convert as well. So he has a, an opportunity almost to plant a church in ways that Luther did not. Luther tried to work with the existing structures and turn them in a Lutheran direction. Calvin could sort of start from scratch, and and therefore he could change church government, he could change worship, and of course they both were changing church teaching. Now there are different points of difference between Calvin and Luther, questions of theology, not significant, but still enough to keep the two churches apart. But I think to emphasize the question of church government, I still don't have a good answer. Maybe if I could read French and German, I had to pass a German exam once upon a time in grad school. I could find the answer to this, but Calvin's church government of this Presbyterian system, he didn't necessarily call it Presbyterian, even though the elders are called presbyters in the New Testament. They're also called bishops as well, or overseers. Um, but I still think it's a remarkably innov well, it's almost radical what he does with church government, because from at least Constantine until the 1530s, the default position for church government is the bishops, and how the bishops relate either within a kingdom back to Rome, or how they relate within the Eastern Empire. There are variations on that theme, but still, it's all bishops. And I mean, I do think Calvin can trace some of his ideas back to the conciliar movement of the 15th century, especially with the Council of Constance trying to remedy the crisis of the Western Church with the so-called Great Schism, where you had for a time two popes, one in Avignon, one in Rome, and the councils became a way to remedy that. And there was greater call both by church leaders and also even by Renaissance humanists that conciliarism was the way to go. Calvin being trained as a humanist, did he pick up on conciliarism in some way? I'm not sure. But in effect, his form of church government was rule of church by council as opposed to bishop. Um, and so that's again part of the freedom that Calvin had um, in Geneva in ways that maybe Luther didn't have. I have a colleague here at Hillsdale just wrote an article. I need to read it more carefully, but on Lutheran ecclesiology. But I mean, they seem to have a mix and match system. Sometimes you can have bishops, sometimes you have presidents within districts. It's not a standard operation the way, generally speaking, either ruled by councils is the case for Reformed and Presbyterian churches.
Okay, so I did a double check. Martin Luther was born in 1483 and John Calvin 1509. So there's a difference of 26 years between them.
26, yes. Thank you.
Now, what fascinates me about reading the Reformers is that there was a sort of proto-Reformation that happened before 1517. The two most notable figures associated with this were Jan Hus of Czech and John Wycliffe of Britain. Um, now, what what were the historical circumstances that in some ways made say, figures like Luther, Calvin, and to a certain extent Zwingli to be household names and not Hus or Wycliffe?
Well, part of the answer is simply that Wycliffe. I don't remember how Huss was in effect executed for his beliefs, so he was a martyr. Um, and I don't remember how Wycliffe died, but I don't think he was in good odor within England, either the church or the crown. But I don't not sure about that. Um, but I mean, so they would, if you're a martyr for a cause, there are people, especially in Eastern or Central Europe, who look to Huss as a hero, as a kind of founding father of Protestant churches in those parts. But what makes Luther so important is that there's just this notoriety that comes with him. I don't remember the author's name, but he wrote a book a few years ago about the kind of pamphlet literature produced in the early days of the Luther controversy. And I think it's persuasive that it's almost akin to a kind of early stages of the internet, where there was just this outpouring of literature that made it possible for Luther's ideas to circulate almost everywhere, and they could be traced back to him, which gave him a kind of prominence, not to mention his testimony before the uh, the emperor at the Diet of Worms, etc. I mean, there are other ways in which he had this big presence in the Holy Roman Empire. Calvin, I mean, Zwingli, I think also to go back to the answer about Huss, Zwingli does die relatively early. He dies in 1531. He's a chaplain for the Swiss soldiers in one of the civil wars early on in the Reformation, and so Zwingli doesn't have a chance to emerge as a kind of leader, and I think even his successor in Zurich, Heinrich Bullinger, is in some ways as big a name as Zwingli. But Calvin, again, because Geneva becomes the center of this influx of refugees, Calvin winds up having all sorts of correspondence to other leaders of Reformed churches or Protestant churches throughout Europe. And there is this network of correspondence that again highlights Calvin's name. And I think that's a big part of the reason why. And it's also the case, I mean, you may have the dates right there. When did Wycliffe die? Do you know right there? Did,
Okay. Yeah, I'm checking it right now. Uh, the 31st of December, 1384.
and Huss was also, I mean, I think early 15th century, if not late
Um,
14th.
early 15, 1415.
Um, so, I mean, it does seem that it would be harder to disseminate information about Huss and Wycliffe prior to the printing press than it was for Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli. Another factor. Yeah.
See. Yeah. Um, what were the major differences and disagreements between the Lutheran and the Reform or Calvinist wings?
Oh, I've looked at this and I may have even mentioned it once or twice when I teach Sunday school to adults on the history of the church, but I don't remember it well. One important, well, fairly important difference, especially if you emphasize doctrine the way both groups do. One important difference is predestination. Calvinists Um, I think this personally, but this is, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't necessarily follow the train of ideas. I think if you're in the world of determinism, it's not all that appealing. But supposedly, Lutherans do not believe that God predestines both the elect and the non-elect, whereas Calvinists believe in double predestination. I mean, I think if you believe God predestined the elect and then kind of like shrugs his shoulder about the non-elect, it seems to me a kind of a double gesture by God. But anyway, maybe it gets you out of the more onerous aspects of predestination. Another important difference, though, is um, is the Lord's Supper. Uh, but again, this is a funny feature of so-called Calvinism. Lutherans, when they think of Calvinism, they think of Zwingli's view, and I think this is even coming under some scrutiny. But Zwingli held a more memorial view of the Lord's Supper, where the supper is merely a symbol of of Christ, but it's not a real communing with Christ. Calvin had a more spiritual view of partaking of the body and blood, but you do so spiritually. And Calvin even has this idea that people communing are raised up into heaven and seated during the Lord's Supper with Christ himself. So there is a kind of spiritual communion that goes on there. Um, and Lutherans, some Lutherans are open to that, but generally speaking, if I ever go to a Lutheran church for worship, I will identify myself. Sometimes they give me permission to commune in the Lord's Supper. Sometimes they do not. So again, the if Lutherans came to a Reformed church, um, they probably wouldn't, if they were devout Lutherans and held strictly to the Lutheran view, they probably would not partake of the Lord's Supper. They would self um, exclude. Um, but I don't think that Presbyterians or Reformed would inherently say Lutherans may not come because of their views of the Lord's Supper. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned the Calvinist view on soteriology. Contemporary debates would place the opponents of that view as Armenians, not as in the nationality of Armenia,
Right.
followers of one Jacobus Arminius. So, did these two men ever corresponded with each other?
No. Arminius lived later. He died around 1610. So he may have been a boy when Calvin was an old man. Um, and what happens in Reformed churches, especially on the continent, in France and the Netherlands, is is a is discomfort with the exclusiveness of the Calvinist view of salvation. So, and the so-called 5 points of Calvinism: total depravity, unconditional election, irresistible grace, sorry, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints.
Philip.
Those 5 points actually come from the Council of Dort, even though there were only four canons there, but you can break one of them up into two and you get the 5 points and you get the tulip, which appeals to the Dutch because they're big in the tulip trade, different points, and Dutch dominated towns in America have these big tulip festivals in the fall, and they're great. So it keeps the brand going. But the canons of the Synod of Dort was arranged in 1618, 1619 to deal with this, the questions that people had, especially about the idea that Christ died only for the elect. Some people wanted a hypothetical atonement where Christ theoretically died for everyone, but it only applied to those who would believe. So there was this kind of tension with the exclusiveness, seemingly, of Calvin's views on salvation and the way they were played out, and try to make it possible for it to be open to more people. So that's where Arminius is coming from. It's also bound up, though, and I don't remember uh, how the actual story goes in the book, but when I was writing the book, it was clear that there were also political alignments between the Arminians in the Dutch provinces, and then the Calvinists in the Dutch provinces, and there, as is the case when you have semi-established churches, uh, the political alignments matter as well to these theological debates.
So tell me about John Knox, who's the Calvinist that's most influential to English-speaking countries. How is he influenced by Calvin?
Knox, I want to say, was probably born around 1520, roughly. Becomes converts uh, and becomes identified with Protestantism in the 1540s. What's striking about England early on is that 1530s is when Church of England becomes Protestant. It does so because Henry the Eighth, sorry, Henry the Eighth needs a male heir, and he goes through what, 8 wives to get 6 wives? I can't remember.
I
I
think
think it's
six.
6 wives.
Six.
Um, but early on, though, the Protestants in England are reading a lot of Lutheran sources. And it's conceivable that the Church of England could sort of go more in a Lutheran direction. But because of refugees going to Geneva and other places on the continent, going to Reformed centers like either Geneva or Heidelberg, um, you, the Protestants in England and Scotland, Knox among them, become committed to a more Reformed or Calvinist view of things. And so Knox is in Geneva in 1553 and beyond until 1558 or so, roughly. That's the reign of Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary, because she persecuted Protestants and set some of them to death and some of them overseas. It's not as if her successor Elizabeth didn't persecute Roman Catholics, or that Henry didn't persecute Roman Catholics either. Thomas More is a great example of this. I'm not trying to whitewash, make it just a Roman Catholics person, but anyway, it's Mary has the title Bloody Mary. Um, and by the way, it's a great drink for brunch, I think. But so Knox flees England, Scotland in the 1550s and becomes the minister in Geneva to the English exiles there, and works with Calvin. And it just dawned on me. I don't know why I didn't ask this before of myself or the literature, um, but I don't know if Calvin spoke or wrote English or read English, and I don't know if Knox must have known French. I'm not, I mean, they would have been able to communicate somehow, but because Knox was ministering to the English speaking exiles, it did mean that the Genevan churches needed somebody who could speak English. Um, so anyway, that's where Knox has the experience that he can't imagine a more reformed church since the time of the apostles, some line like that. And Calvin lives only about 9 more years. So after uh, Calvin's death, there's also correspondence between the Scottish reformers and Theodore Beza, who succeeds Calvin as sort of the chief voice of the Geneva churches. And Beza and others help clarify some points at times about what the Scottish church should do in relation to bishops, in relation to the monarch. but it's a 1560 is when the Scottish, so-called Scottish Reformation happens, when Parliament there recognizes Reformed Church and disavows being overseen by Rome. And I think, Knox lives until about 1572 or so, and then other Scottish leaders pick up um, the task of reforming the church. And it is from the Scottish church, still to this day, that American Presbyterians, at least, as well as the Irish, Canadian, we look at our church government, forms of church government, trace them back to the first or second books of discipline for the Scottish church that Knox and then his successors were responsible for. I believe the first book of discipline is sometime in the 1560s. The second one is, I think, about 1578. And that is the one that I know American Presbyterians in the 19th century were still using as a kind of model for understanding Presbyterian church government.
Mhm. So tell me about the history of Calvinist church institutions in America.
Um, so the this is good preparation for my Religion in America class, which I have to start teaching tomorrow, because I have to figure out how to make sense of all the different Christians and non-Christian groups that come to America. But I guess if you exclude the Puritans, and there are plenty of people who would not want to exclude Puritanism from Calvinism, but because the Puritans were congregational in their polity, uh, if you're using the Reformed standard of rule by councils, the Puritans don't measure up. So that means that the first official body of Presbyterian Reformed type churches comes in 1706 with the Presbytery of Philadelphia, formed largely by Scots and Scotch Irish or Ulster Protestants who are largely in Pennsylvania, New York, sorry, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, where there was greater measures of religious freedom than in the Episcopalian states or colonies like Virginia, New York, or up in New England with the official churches there. And then Presbyterianism, that church grows and becomes the mainline Presbyterian church, the Presbyterian Church USA. By 1789, they hold their first General Assembly. But there are other Scottish Presbyterian groups like the Covenanters. These are Presbyterians who are still attached to the Scottish National Covenant of 1638, still attached to the Solemn League and Covenant that Parliament signed on to, the English Parliament signed on to in 1643, and then that these Covenanters want, when the monarchy is restored in 1660, want Charles II to re-up his commitment to the National Covenant. They don't get that out of him, so they kind of persist in some kind of opposition to the government, and they violate laws that say they can't meet in certain locations, etc. They go out into the fields and preach there. The Covenanters, though, eventually, some of them come to North America in the 18th century, and I believe that they formed their first presbytery in 1743. But another group of Scots are the Associate Reformed, and they leave the main church, the Church of Scotland, in 1733. They're, I think I called them the Associate Reformed Presbytery. And this has to do with a controversy over doctrine, also a controversy over patronage, as far as whether the patron of a parish should have the say in selecting a minister, or whether the congregation should also have a voice and maybe a veto power over the patron's views. If the patron, though, is paying for the minister, you can understand why he or she might expect to get their way. But anyway, the associate reformed come also in the 18th century and begin to form their own presbyteries. And then the German reforms show up, 1720s, and begin to organize in different ways a federation of churches in the mid 18th century. And the Dutch Reform. The Dutch Reformed are in North America. Maybe I should have started with them, actually, because the original colony, which is now New York, was originally New Netherland, and it was a Dutch colony, and Dutch churches went there and were formed throughout the 17th century. And those churches eventually, under the British system, formed their own organizations in the 18th century as well. One other measure, though, of this too, when you begin to see independence, I think, of the American communions from Europe, is when the colonies or the United States churches no longer have to send their training for pastors, when they no longer have to send their prospective ministers to Europe or to the British Isles for training. And in the case, say, of Presbyterians, Presbyterians get their first seminary with Princeton in 1812. So you could argue it takes them at least almost 25 years after the first General Assembly for them to have their own institution. Prior to that, in the 18th century, a lot of Presbyterians would go back to the University of Glasgow or Edinburgh for their training. Sometimes they would go to Harvard or Yale as well, and then do an apprenticeship. And in the case of the German Reformed finally get their first seminary, which eventually becomes Mercersburg Seminary. They begin to organize that around 1825, but it takes these churches in America longer to begin to form their own institutions. It's one thing to have a church government body, whether a synod, a presbytery, a general assembly. All that takes is the ministers to go to that meeting, whenever the meetings are held, to actually put together the resources for a faculty, to pay the faculty, to designate the faculty who would train ministers is a bigger lift for the churches. And that's another, I think, way you can look at the growing infrastructure of these churches.
Mhm. Yeah, you mentioned the emphasis on church government quite a bit in the Presbyterian view. Uh, I think Americans should remember that the only clergyman to sign the Declaration was a Presbyterian minister, the Reverend John Witherspoon. So, to what extent can you connect the Presbyterian view of church government and the American view of civil government?
Well, I don't want to answer this question because I want you to have me on again, because I have a book coming out next year about Presbyterians and British government. No, but I will be glad to answer it. And I know maybe more than you want to know about this. The King George III, called the American Revolution a Presbyterian rebellion. And there are different ways of thinking. You can find echoes of that in the literature of the time, 1770s, even 60s. And in some ways, I think George was also lumping Puritans in with that. So that's a more expansive view of Presbyterianism. Maybe he should have used Calvinism instead of Presbyterianism. But in the case of Witherspoon, Witherspoon was a Scotsman, came to America 1768 to preside over the College of New Jersey, which became Princeton University eventually. And he was a member of the Continental Congress, served from New Jersey. Witherspoon, though, wanted basically, and I think a lot of people don't remember this about the founding, that a lot of the founders, Franklin included, hoped for a settlement of the hostilities that would have kept America within the British Empire because the colonies, the American colonies, had done very well in the economic exchange provided by the British Empire, as well as the kind of peace and security. So Witherspoon held that view, and he wanted, I think, an arrangement similar to what Scotland had within the United Kingdom. Scotland did not have a parliament after the Union, I'm pretty sure. So Scotland parliament is you know abolished is probably too strong, but the Scots are now represented in London through the English Parliament, British Parliament, and Witherspoon was hoping that the American colonies could have a similar sort of place within the British system. Traveling across the ocean at that time was a big endeavor. So how you would have representation across the Atlantic could be a really difficult thing. The Irish wanted this as well. And for a time, the Irish had their own parliament, then they would have representation in London. It's easier to get from Ireland to London than it is from America. But anyway, um, people like Witherspoon were not itching for independence, not itching for war, but on the whole, what they wanted was basically self-determination, self-rule, and they didn't have a voice in their own government. Um, the really revolutionary part of Presbyterian history, I would argue, is not the American Revolution, which had the support, obviously, of many people who were not Presbyterian. James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, a whole host of people were not Presbyterian, so it was hardly a Presbyterian rebellion. What was particularly revolutionary was the 1630s and 40s in England and Scotland. There, after the National Covenant with the Scots in 1638, uh, Charles and his Archbishop Laud tried to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church, and that leads to something called the Bishops' War. There were two of them, very brief. I think there were injuries, but almost no deaths. A lot of maybe grandstanding, but armies did assemble. But that does lead then into when the English Parliament goes to war with Charles, the Scots are going to be allies with Parliament, and so they're going to participate in that war, and that war eventually leads to the trial of Charles for treason and his execution in 1649, and that's a big deal. And in fact, the Presbyterians in Scotland are not in any way approving of that because it's the Stuart monarchs, beginning with James the First, then his son Charles the First. Those are the ones who could possibly keep the national covenant in view. So there doesn't make any sense to kill the king who is necessary to having a national covenant. So the Scots are not in any way happy with what Cromwell and the Rump Parliament does. But if you want to think about a kind of revolutionary moment, it happens in the mid 17th century, and the Presbyterians in Scotland have a hand in leading up to that, although not a direct hand in the execution of Charles.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'd like to reconvene with you when the book is published. Do you have a working title? Yep.
It's called Protestants and Patriots,
Mm,
colon, or semi, no, colon, Presbyterians in the Age of Revolution. Um,
okay.
yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah, can't wait to read it. All right. So, finally, outside of Europe and America and the Western world in general, where can we find a significant Calvinist Christian presence?
Well, two examples, three actually come to mind. Brazil, there is a large and vibrant Presbyterian church there. It wouldn't it wouldn't be all of Americans' cup of tea when it comes to ideas about worship, perhaps. But there's a very strong Presbyterian church there. There's been a lot of interaction, both historically and currently, between parts of American Presbyterianism and Brazilian Presbyterianism. Korea is another example, and for a variety of odd reasons, Presbyterianism did very well there, although Methodism did as well. It's not as if Presbyterians run the show among Korean Protestants, but um, it, Presbyterianism did far better in Korea than in Japan or China. And it's a curious set of circumstances that make that possible. And then the other example is South Africa, where it's a combination of both Reformed and Presbyterian churches. South Africa originally is a Dutch colony, so the Reformed churches would be prominent. Eventually, the British take over running South Africa. Dutch people migrate into the out of it, and eventually there's a Boer War, the end of the 19th century. The English and the Dutch don't necessarily get along on that, but still, that's another place you could think of where there is a Presbyterian and Reformed set of institutions that are strong, and all of these either are cases of colonialism, where colonists went out and settled there and established churches, or missions, which is something that works far more with indigenous populations and encourages indigenous churches. So that's what there are chapters in the book about missions and also about colonialism. Colonialism is very much in the crosshairs of people who are progressive or liberal, and missions is also not necessarily a higher view because it's very much associated with colonialism. And I think, in fact, missionaries generally went where the different empires of Europe had gone, so it's hard to disaggregate missions from colonialism. But anyway, those are three places where you could argue has been a strong Reformed and Presbyterian presence.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Professor Hart of Hillsdale College, for joining the show.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.